My name is Pierre Audi. I'm the new artistic director of the Park Avenue Armory. I'm very pleased to make my first little speech in front of you tonight. Just a few words. This is a new conversation series, which the Armory is very proud of. It's a wonderful initiative. It's an attempt also to offer our audiences a context for the very special performances that happen here. It offers perspective to prepare audiences, but sometimes also audiences have seen the show and will enjoy meeting artists after having seen the work. So in either form, these talks are intended to enrich your experience of what happens here. We intend to go on with this series in which artists, scholars, cultural leaders, social trailblazers will be invited to take part, and we hope that you enjoy them and you decide to come to other ones and talk about this series with friends so that there is a momentum that will build, hopefully, and be returned back into the performances. We feel that that's really a very important frame to the work that the Armory is trying to do here. We're delighted tonight to welcome a wonderful group of fabulous artists who have made the performance of Materie. The production has been very warmly received, and I'm very thrilled about that. I would like to introduce Cori Ellison, the dramaturg, who will moderate tonight, and composer Louis Andriessen, director Heiner Goebbels, and conductor Peter Rundel.
Good evening. Those of you who have seen this piece already know that you're in for a really amazing evening. And those of you who haven't have probably read or heard that you're in for an amazing evening. So without further ado, it has not failed to escape my notice that I'm surrounded this evening by a group of real Renaissance men. I mean, that everyone here who's on stage now and who has taken part in bringing Materie here to the Armory is really a man of multiple talents, multiple disciplines. I think, well, first of all, Mr. Goebbels is a director and a composer, which is a quite unusual combination. And Mr. Audi, an impresario and also a quite distinguished director and producer as well. And Mr. Rundel, a violinist, a conductor, a teacher, and of course, Mr. Andriessen, our distinguished composer for the evening. So I wanted to start out by posing a question really to all of you, any and all of you, which is that this extraordinary piece, Materie, has been described. If you read the program note in the program books, John Henkin, the LA Philharmonic, writes that it's been described as a non-narrative opera in 4 acts, also a dramatic symphony in 4 movements, or also a 4 musical essays on the idea of matter versus spirit. And I believe elsewhere in the program, Mr. Goebbels has called it a large-scale musical, philosophical theater work. And finally, on the poster in front of the Armory, the Guardian is quoted as calling it an unclassifiable hybrid. So, gentlemen, my first question to all of you is, what have we here in your own estimations? And it'll be interesting to see if you agree and intersect on how you would really describe this piece.
Me too. Me first.
Yes. You're the one who thought of that.
First of all, I would like to compliment you with the perfect how do you call that? Pronunciation of the title.
Okay.
That's very good. It's very difficult for Americans. It's the Materie. It's very good. So my compliments for that. This doesn't help you at all, but at least we sort of have an idea about that things like that are important. I don't know. So now I'm here and heard the piece and saw what Heiner made and all the forces of the performers. It's a very impressive situation. Also, in the first place, of this amazing hall. The whole building is very impressive, I think, also. All this together have certainly influence on how you perceive things. But if you ask me what is the piece itself, it is certainly a lot of different things. And that is when you are a young, ambitious composer who does read a lot also, and has a lot of adventures in life and in thinking about things, and is the child of a profoundly musical milieu, then you can imagine that there is a moment in your life that this all comes together in a very strange way. And I think that is the best way to explain it from the psychological side of who you are at a certain moment. I couldn't write a piece like that, probably not anymore. I would do it different, perhaps also. And I must say that I'm quite happy with the piece in itself. I think the fact that there are so many different things probably more interesting than all the intellectual lines and connections there are. It's almost like a very complicated structure as far as numbers and lengths and all this kind. And all these things were much more important when I was teaching composition and nowadays I think the verrassing, the Überraschung, as the Germans say, surprising sides is probably more interesting for me now than earlier. It's difficult to say. Well, now I should stop talking because I talk all the time.
We're here to hear you talk, as well as our colleagues here. Any other thoughts? Maestro, from a musical standpoint, how do you approach this piece in terms of its structure?
I mean, to answer your question, or to try to answer your question, of course, you could look in a kind of traditional way on this piece, and you could say that from a purely musical point of view, it stands in the great tradition of symphonies also, or it's a mixture between a symphony and a cantata, which already you had in, let's say, in some Mahler symphonies, or even where an extra musical thought is formulated, and where you have reflections about the world, kind of philosophical reflections about what is the world. And in that sense, you could, I mean, with the four movements, with the first movement, which explores this material, with the second movement as a kind of slow movement, with the third movement as a scherzo, and then with the last movement as a kind of summary and a big adagio, if you want, dealing with death also. So in that sense, you could say it stands in this tradition, even if this doesn't explain the outstanding quality of that piece.
I would say mainly it's a piece of art. And no, also in the deep sense that I think any strong artistic experience means, that's how we can define it, means an encounter with something we haven't seen or heard. This is true about a fantastic painting or a strong sculpture or installation work. And it has to do with the unclassifiability of it. As soon as you can classify it, then you reduce it to something which you know already. to a certain framework. And as soon as it refuses this classification, I think you have a better chance to really to be confronted with something for which you might not have the right words. And this is even then a stronger artistic encounter. And that's why I would say it's a piece of art. Maybe it's a tableau with 4 colorful sounding paintings, whatever, but it's not what fits into the categories which we are used to on music theater. And that's why, since it had only been staged once, that's why I was so happy to find it and to restage it to an audience which was completely unknown to it.
Well, one remarkable thing, of course, is that this work, I believe you wrote it between 1984 and 88, and it had its world premiere in Amsterdam in 89, and I think was performed in its entirety in New York in concert version in, was it late 80s, 90s or something like that. But the fact is, am I correct in saying that it hasn't actually been staged, fully staged, the entire thing, since its world premiere in 1989?
That's right.
That's pretty incredible. And to what do you attribute that?
Should I answer?
Sure.
When I had the job when I was appointed director of the opera in Amsterdam in June '88. My first job was to troubleshoot a production that was in difficulty. And this production was going to be the world premiere of Louis Andriessen's new opera, Materie, to be directed by famous American director Robert Wilson, whom I knew very well, and I knew Louis less well than I knew Bob Wilson. What I quickly realized in this so-called troubleshooting was that, in fact, the world of this opera, which is very conceptual, which on paper looked like it was an ideal piece for Robert Wilson, who's a master of abstraction and conceptualism, visual conceptualism in his own way, actually was a very difficult piece for Robert Wilson to really understand and manage to bring out. In a way, the imagery of Bob's work sort of canceled the piece. And so the real world premiere is Heiner's production, really.
Wow.
Because the first production was a complicated struggle of what is this piece. Of course, there were beautiful images by Bob Wilson. He added knee plays, his famous knee plays, which was little comic things on the side of the stage, as if he was scared of the piece. And I could see all this tragedy in front of me, but I had to troubleshoot and try to do my best to end up keeping Louis happy and making Bob sort of, do it. So it happened, the production, and it was fine, but it didn't have, not remotely, the impact that later the concert performances of the Materie had 10 years later. So when people didn't have the production by Robert Wilson in front of them, they started to hear the music, they started to appreciate the richness of the piece, totally without images, but just as a monumental piece of music. So that was stage number 2. And then Heiner arrived and discovered the piece again, and actually mounted it for the first time. And in a way, as a composer, because Heiner is primarily a composer, not a director. He's not a director. He's a wonderful director, but he's really a composer. And it is this genius of composer-director because he has a wonderful taste and a fantastic skill to direct. But he actually went straight to the heart of the piece and found the visual keys that were necessary to unlock the theatricality of the piece as a timeless masterpiece, which already we started to discover when it was in concert, but now it was completed by the right production theatrically. And so that's really the story, and that sometimes happens, that a world premiere production can sort of, not take off, because you cast somebody who's, not necessarily very attuned to modern music, or, and whose imagery you think on paper is very similar to the piece, but in fact it's not really, it's very far away from the piece. So it's a beautiful story, and I'm very, very touched to be here, to see the piece here in New York, and I've seen the production in Germany, and it's a wonderful production, and I'm thrilled that people have rediscovered this piece. I'm now busy with Louis' fifth opera, which is a new piece that we will do in May, and that's a very, very different piece from this one. So in a way, it's kind of amazing that this is possible, and that this is now appreciated by a new generation of audiences. This is the second opera of Louis that's been staged in New York. The one that was seen here before in Lincoln Center was Writing to Vermeer, in collaboration with Peter Greenaway, and that was a production by the Dutch National Opera, which we brought to New York. So this is actually the second opera of his that's staged in New York.
That was a great production, terrific production. Yes?
May I add something to discuss why such a mind-breaking work for the development of music theater has difficulties in the institution? Because I think this is not only due to the first staging, which was had some troubles. It has to do with the fact that this opera really doesn't match what the institution of an opera, which is 150 years old, really asks for. And we have, I know it, we have about 80 opera houses in Germany, 80. And there's sitting dramaturgs and intendants and directors sitting day and night looking for operas which they can do. They could have found that, but they didn't find it because it doesn't belong to what the conventional idea of an opera is expecting. Like you put it in this funny phrase and saying there's a soprano and a tenor, but they're not in love. And there's no bass who finds it boring. It's true. It's not a love story. It's not a story, and this is the most remarkable thing, which connects this work also a little bit to the piece I could show here some years ago, Stifters Dinge. It's not a piece in which the human subjects are in the center, and that's what opera is all about. Opera is always about relationships, about representative relationships, psychological confrontations between people. This opera doesn't have any psychological confrontation. One with God, and one with the state, and one with radioactivity, but it's really an opera which is demanding to confront us with other forces. And apart from also technical resources which are difficult for an opera orchestra, like to have so many good saxophone players and to switch between theater and aria and very different aesthetics of the movements. I think this is the main point why this work is so interesting for me, and also why this work has so much difficulty to arrive in the repertoire.
That's really interesting. Now,
Because just to say one final word, because it's a little bit my favorite theme. Usually, the opera houses don't produce, there's exceptions, of course, in Amsterdam, but usually opera houses don't produce what the art needs, or the development of the art needs, but they produce what the house needs. They need to have, for the singers, they have protagonist roles, so that the singers can say, I have sang Aida here, and I've sang this role here, and this main character, and this main character. It's not a main character in the Materie, which you can write in your biography. So all these things define the repertoire, and that's why this work is so important.
As a composer approaching this work by another composer, and such an unusual work, as you point out, a non-linear story, did you find your way into imagining a visual world for it primarily through the music or through the words or for a combination of both?
I think you have to avoid this track. You have to avoid the track to illustrate something or to represent something which might be a topic. You have to find a parallel strategy which not has necessarily, I said this already some days ago here, it not has necessarily something to do with having ideas, but rather with having an obsession yourself which connects in an unconscious way to the musical phrases, to the musical temperature and character, and then to find a visual solution which is somehow connected, but you, not even yourself, you know why. And this tension keeps me surprised as a director, it keeps the audience surprised, and it keeps meaning not as a result of what I want to tell you, but meaning as an individual construction of the audience. Because who am I to tell you what to think about this opera? So it's really about, you have to make up your mind of what you see and what you hear, and what you see and what you hear is not necessarily the same thing, and that's why it's so interesting. And so you have to find experimentally visuals which don't identify with the music, but also which are not against the music, which not superimpose other ideas on top of those of the composers. It's really very difficult. And whenever I do a piece, I start 1 year before the opening with maybe a first week of rehearsals. And I remember this 1 year before our German opening, we invited the sheep already, without knowing in which part they would play, without knowing if we would ever invite them again. And just as an experimental approach of testing music, different musical parts with images. We experimented with laser because somewhere in the score it says you want to have a laser. You remember? Louis Andriessen. It says in the score, I think for the third movement, it says you see a laser or something. So I said we have to order a laser. Louis says he needs a laser. So we ordered a laser. But we thought it was very much 80s. Sorry, Louis. And so we skipped the laser. But that's how you have to do it. You can't just have an idea and do it and build it, and that's not how it works.
May I ask, though, because I think there's been tremendous interest in the sheep, who have become quite celebrity status in New York, covered it all. How actually did the idea of inviting the sheep first occur to you? What?
I spoke already about that a lot in several interviews. Let's reduce it to something which I didn't know. And this happened nearly half a year after our premiere. Then I remembered that in my childhood, my father, who was an engineer, he took me to an airport for gliders once a week after work when the sun went down. And this was a big plateau overlooking a provincial town in Germany and was housed by a herd of sheep. And I had my first encounters with shepherds. And I remember I saw the shepherd, he was standing on such a shepherd, how do you call it? Croc? Crack? Croc. Anyway, he was standing there, and I said, what do I have to do? And I was like 8 years old, and I said, what do I have to do to be a shepherd? And then he said, you have to make the shepherd exam. And and I said, what does it mean, shepherd exam? He said, you have to stand 1 hour on such a stick. So that was my first encounter with a shepherd. And over these sheep, which I looked at once every week, over the sheep, they were cruising the gliders, like zeppelins. But I completely forgot about it. But this obviously was also a reenactment of a very early childhood picture, which now I see every night in New York, in the Armory.
Thank you. Now, Maestro, this is a score in which it's often been pointed out that there's a great deal of significance given to the numbers 3 and 4. That's true, isn't it? Yes.
Well, Materie is more than that. It's about 4 numbers: 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Okay. 4 movements.
Also, that is one of the things you can find out, and the 4 movements certainly. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 together is 10. And 10 is 10 times 10 is already twice 10 is 100. Mm-hmm. And 100 was my idea about a length for a large work of this size. And in fact, it is the 4 parts are all more or less the same length, so 25 minutes, and the whole piece lasts about 100 minutes. Mm-hmm. So this is. Everything already is planned in that sense, kind of the intellectual, technical side of the composing. Mm-hmm. And that word, it's very a strong part. It's on all kinds of levels. It's organized and taking a responsibility to why this harmony and not other harmony. Of course, there's a 1, 2, 3, 4 chord, which for the technicians is very simple to recognize on several moments, especially on the golden section. I mean, all these sort of things play a role in the piece.
And how does that affect your work as the conductor? Certainly having all the information about the various things that are encoded in the piece and the influences on the music. When you approach to conduct this piece and communicate with the musicians who are going to perform it, how much do all of those things play into your interpretation?
Well, to say the truth, it's something which I enjoy very much to know and also to study in advance. But for the realization of the piece, it's some additional information which might be inspiring for the musicians, which I certainly give, but it doesn't really help in the realization of the piece. Of course, I have to be aware of the tempo relations as a conductor, so I'm responsible to give the timing and the tempi, and it helps, of course, for me that there is a strong link. But the difficulties of the realizations are different. They are first of all, it is an extreme score it's extremely physical for everybody who is involved. I mean, especially the orchestra, because of the sheer power of the music, also the loudness. For instance, the brass, they really work each evening, yeah. And so the work is like in any great music for me. is of course to organize everything, to make it happen in the smoothest way possible, then to take care about balance, very important. And of course, in a opera production like this, in a theatrical productions, there are difficulties which are added by the distances we have to overcome. Yeah? So the choir is far away, the tenor is far away. So this is a lot of work to bring that all together. But I should not forget that there is one additional element, which is we have everything is amplified. And so a lot of these questions are also to solve together with the sound director, which is Norbert Ommer, which is a very important part of the work.
Now, most of the company, most of this production is taken exactly from what you did at the Ruhr Festival and brought it here, but actually the one major element that's different, of course, is the orchestras. Isn't that correct? Here you have...
This is absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how did that affect? Of course, it's quite an orchestra. You know, ICE is just there.
Yeah, it's my first time I work with them, and
Amazing.
actually it's the first time that I work with a New York-based orchestra, which means a lot to me. And I mean, I came here now, I think it's 2 weeks ago, and we started to work, and I was very, very, very impressed, not only about the quality, the sheer quality of the individual players, but also from the spirit of the ensemble. I mean, they really love his music. They knew it. Most of them knew it before, which is not necessarily usual. You know, they knew it before, and there were people and they told me, "Well, we are dreaming to do this piece for many years." You know, and you feel that, and you feel it every evening, and it gives me a lot of pleasure, not only in the work but also in the performances.
That's wonderful. Now, this is a piece, one other aspect of it that I find fascinating is, well, you know, there's just, it works out on so many levels, like an amazingly complex puzzle. But one aspect of it, the text, almost all of it is based in Dutch history. And did you first have the idea, sort of the theme that you wanted, and then found the texts for them, or how did you go about finding the texts?
Well, the order was, first of all, to find out about the problem of which is the subject of the opera. I think the problem, what does the human person with his mind and his spirit and his feelings with what is surrounding him in the most wide sense of the word. That is where it started. And then I also remember that I was walking down in Denmark, strange enough, in Copenhagen, with composers and on a stair downstairs. And I said to my colleague, this was very strange. I saw this, it was a duo for contrabassoon and double bass. And I said, I suddenly realized that the two instruments are totally different, but and they have to be, but from the other hand, they have one thing in common. They're made from the same material, wood, right? And that is very strange. It was a contradiction. That is been the core for the whole piece. And then I started to think about, so I have to find forms of how artists in general, or scientists, or all kinds of, you had to read every book about, totally ridiculous. How did they deal with this kind of things, about the real, the physical elements? And slowly by slowly, it became these 4 parts. And quite soon, I decided also, because there are too many books, of course, I decided to do it based all upon the Dutch history. And it was an interesting subject because, like the way Heiner started when we were both young, we were extremely outspoken about very typical for the 60s and the 70s. We were very left-wing, and we had both organized street orchestras to sing political songs. And also that makes me the completely wrong composer for opera, because my experiences come from working with small theater groups in the 70s, when I was really very young. and even earlier and after, who were all Brecht-oriented. And he was the hero of what was for us modern theater. And there were then writers and that was the way Heiner started also, writers who wrote anarchist, strange texts. I made anarchist, strange music. At that time, a group like that, there were chances, and now in Holland it's totally impossible, to have live musicians also for the performances. That is where I have learned to do what I want to do. And actually, the move to the opera is more like that I was, thrown in like you were in a taxi and the taxi throws you out. This is where you have to be, because it's basically the same what I did with Baal and all this kind of names of little groups, but then they bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it's jumped. So I think Materie is in fact the first performance, but I consider it as a Marxist piece also still, if you really want to know that.
We do.
Actually, the whole world opera doesn't say, the whole repertoire doesn't say me very much. And one of the jokes in Holland, of course, is the real opera composer in the 1700s, of course, is Johann Sebastian Bach with the Passions. That are the best operas, I think, are being written in the 1700s.
Yes.
Absolutely. And it has to do with that. There are a lot of things I don't, realism I don't like at all in art. I don't like horror, I don't like sentimentality. There are so many things I don't like.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've managed to, without all those things you don't like, put together quite an imposing piece. Now, please.
I just wanted to add that we have another grandfather together, I think, which is Hans Eisler.
Yeah.
Because at the same time, when you were working with the Volharding on the streets of Amsterdam, and I had my so-called left radical brass band in Frankfurt, at the same time, I worked with music of Hans Eisler, and one of your first compositions was your adaptation of the Maßnahme from the music of Hans Eisler. That was also happening at the same time in the middle of the 70s.
And you were aware of each other way back then?
I had the score. I had the score from his adaptation of the Maßnahme, but we didn't meet directly at that time. No.
That's amazing. Well, I was going to ask, actually, being, Mr. Audi, that you were around at the time of the world premiere of this in Amsterdam and involved. There is one part of the text, and only one, I believe, that is not Dutch, and it comes at the very end. And can you tell us the story of how the episode of Madame Curie crept into this work?
Can you answer that, you think?
You have to answer that.
Yeah.
Not me.
Probably we have talked about it together, but it's very evident that is an exception. And I think I have told this before those days, but it doesn't matter. When it became clear that Bob Wilson was to do the direction, I had already 3 parts finished. And I was busy with the last part, and the last part I had sort of vague ideas about death and about love and about music. I wanted to find letters from a preferably Dutch composer to Dievenbroek actually was the man, who had a secret relation with a student of him. He sent her to Paris to study and he said, it was 1880, something like that. He said, when you are there, you should try to find this young guy who composes very interestingly, Debussy. Nobody had ever heard about him in Holland at that time. So, and I didn't find it. I have really read everything about the man, and I didn't find it. And then around that time, Wilson showed up, and we had long conversations about the last part. And I will think about it, he said. And then he came with this Madame Curie text, which I found really very impressive, and the only problem was it was not Dutch. But I found it a little bit too stiff to say no for that reason. And I also realized, my father could have said that too, really rigid composers, but the good ones, have always all the times exceptions. Mm-hmm. So that is the exception on the rule that it is all Dutch culture.
I see. And again, there are certain passages of the opera which are in English. And are those originally, or in the Ruhr, were they done in German? the passages that we have here in English, or?
No, it's all Dutch. Apart from the Madame Curie was, well, we did it in Dutch, of course. We said,
Yeah, we did it in English, yeah.
I see. And how did you take the decision that certain parts are not set to music, that certain parts are actually spoken? How did you decide upon that?
Yeah, of course. I think when you write an opera, you should not talk. That is a sort one of the traditions and the conventions of the opera. But since the thing I do for the theater come from theater, and there is a lot of talking in the theater all the time, so we should not be completely against that. And I do it in the opera now, which Pierre does in LA also. Sometimes people start talking. It's a kind of special singing for me now.
I see. Now, this opera or symphony or series of tableaus, as you will call it, it's often been commented upon that your style in general is very eclectic, that the influences on your music come from many different places. This piece is particularly influenced by Bach. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, but I don't want to. I don't think there are too many people who do recognize very much in the score. That's a little bit of a problem. It's a formal way of dealing. The word eclectic, I don't like at all. Eclectic is a word you say to mediocre philosophers who think Nietzsche 1-2 phrases and then Plato 1-2 phrases to make friends with everybody. I don't want to be friends with everybody.
Okay. But there are discernible influences from different.
Yeah, but when you ask Mozart or Bach, I talked yesterday about Mozart and Bach already, so what I'm doing here. So it's the same. There's almost no real good composer who not accepts the fact and knows that there are two kinds of composers, the good ones and the bad ones. The bad ones, they are eclectic, I would say. They think all these other things. The real good ones, they steal. That's a big difference.
Okay.
I think I quote Stravinsky now. I'm not completely sure.
Well, I think that when we see the performance tonight, you will see what I mean. That there's a lot in this piece to talk about. There really is a lot of background and a lot of things that add richness to our experience of seeing it. But when all is said and done, the experience of seeing and hearing this wonderful, really one-of-a-kind piece is something that very much stands on its own. So I want to thank all of these gentlemen for sharing their thoughts with us.
Wait. Before we go, I would like this ideal moment to say something important. I want to say, first of all, Pierre, welcome here. And then I want both you and Heiner thank for, I think it's a very important moment in my life, what you have done. And it's very difficult to really explain why it's so sublime. But I have to thank you both very much for what you have done. Thank you very much. Thank you.